My daughter gave away my dog Rusty without telling me, saying he dirtied the house and ate too much. I am Sylvia, 75 years old, a former midwife, living as a burden in my own home. She doesn't know that without the dog, her security turns to dust. The midday sun beat down heavily on the poorly paved streets of our neighborhood. I was walking slowly, dragging my thick-soled shoes and carrying 2 canvas bags from the market that weighed heavier on my soul than on my arms. At 75, the body no longer responds with the same rush as before, but my legs still hold me up. For over 40 years, I was the midwife in this area, back when this was nothing but wild brush and the streets didn't even have names. My hands, now covered in dark spots and bulging veins, brought half the neighbors into the world, people who today don't even give me a good morning. I know the smell of life, the sweat, the blood, and the cry of that first breath. I know that life is dirty and loud. That is why the absolute silence that greeted me when I opened the iron gate of my own house froze my blood immediately. Normally, the squeak of those rusted hinges was the signal for Rusty to shoot out from the backyard. I would hear the clicking of his thick nails against the concrete, followed by a happy panting and the thud of his brown tail against the walls. Rusty was a big dog, a mix of street mutt and Belgian Malinois, with a rough, toasted brown coat and amber eyes that understood everything before I even opened my mouth. But that afternoon, there was no clicking, no panting, just the hum of the central air conditioning that my daughter Melissa kept running at all hours. I set the bags on the kitchen island. The air smelled of bleach and artificially scented lavender disinfectant, a smell I absolutely despise because it masks reality. In the corner of the laundry room, where Rusty's aluminum bowl and old wool blanket always sat, there was nothing. The floor was damp and freshly mopped. A cold knot tightened in the pit of my stomach. I reached into my apron pocket and squeezed my heavy iron keys. Those keys are ancient. They opened the original padlocks on the gates my late husband installed decades ago. Squeezing them always gives me a sense of grounding. A reminder that this land, even though it's now covered in porcelain tiles and minimalist furniture, is still mine. I walked into the living room. Melissa was sitting on her white sofa, the one nobody is allowed to touch without washing their hands first. She was typing on her phone, legs crossed and iced coffee resting on the glass coffee table. She wore her pristine gym clothes, her hair pulled back without a single strand out of place. Her husband, Preston, a man with soft hands and an even softer spine, who works at a bank, wasn't home. "Where is the dog?" I asked, my voice flat, trying to control the tremor in my lips. Melissa didn't even look up from the glowing screen of her device. "Mom, that animal dirties everything," she said with a casualness that hit me like an open-handed slap across the face. "He leaves hair on my new rugs, he smells like an old dog, and he eats too much. I gave him to a family out in the country. He'll have space to run and get as dirty as he wants out there. He'll be happier." I froze. The words bounced around in my head, making no sense at first. She gave him to a family out in the country. Rusty wasn't a living room ornament you just donate when it no longer matches the decor. Rusty had slept at the foot of my bed for 9 years. He was my shadow, my companion, the only living thing in this giant house who actually noticed if I was still breathing at night. Feeling like I was suffocating, I managed to force the words out. "You took my dog, my only companion, and you got rid of him while I was out buying your vegetables." Melissa let out an annoyed sigh, locked her phone screen, and finally looked at me. Her eyes, so much like her father's, held not a single drop of guilt. They were filled with that condescending impatience children develop when they decide their parents are no longer people, just old pieces of furniture to be tolerated. "Oh, Mom, please don't start with the drama. We already talked about this." "Well, I hinted at it plenty of times. This house isn't for an animal like that. Preston and I spent a lot of money remodeling the downstairs so you could live comfortably with us. The least we expect is to keep the place clean. Besides, you didn't even know how to take care of him properly anymore. He could barely get up." "He is a living creature, Melissa." I raised my voice, feeling the hot anger rising in my throat. "He's not a rug, he's my dog. 9 years he's been with me. 9 years taking care of me." "Preston and I take care of you," she snapped back, crossing her arms. "We pay the electric bill, the water, and we buy your medication. The dog was an unnecessary expense and a walking infection hazard. It's done, Mom. The people who took him live 2 hours away. I don't even have their direct number because it was through an online group. So please don't ask me to bring him back. Go rest. I'll put the groceries away. I wanted to scream. I wanted to raise my hand and slap her face in a way I never did when she was a little girl, just to see if it would wake her up from her bubble of pure selfishness. But experience has taught me that uncontrolled rage is completely useless. As a midwife, I've been in situations where life hangs by a thread, where mothers are bleeding out or babies aren't breathing. In those moments, panic is death. You have to keep a cold mind and steady hands. I squeezed the iron keys in my pocket again. I felt the jagged edge of the metal biting into the skin of my palm. The physical pain anchored me to reality. I turned around without saying another word. I walked down the long hallway that leads to my room, dragging my feet a little more than usual. The silence of the house now felt deafening. I stepped into my bedroom and carefully closed the door. Here inside my four walls, the smell of Rusty still lingered. A scent of dry earth, sunshine, and loyalty. I looked at the foot of my bed. There was the sunken indentation on the worn little rug where he spent his nights. For 9 years, the rhythm of his breathing was my lullaby. When arthritis kept me awake and the pain made me cry quietly so I wouldn't wake anyone, Rusty would get up, rest his heavy head on my knees, and lick my hand until I calmed down. I sat on the edge of the mattress. My knees were shaking, and finally the tears I had held back in front of Melissa began to fall. I cried in the quiet, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. I cried for my dog, scared and confused somewhere far away, surrounded by strangers, wondering why his owner had abandoned him. I cried for the humiliation of being treated like an unwanted guest in the very house I built brick by brick with my late husband. But above all, I cried for my daughter's immense ignorance. Melissa actually believes that just because she slapped some cheap security cameras on the front porch and swapped the solid wood door for a shiny aluminum one, we are safe. She lives completely deluded by her own sense of superiority. Doesn't she realize that our house, even though it's now surrounded by new subdivisions, backs right up to the old canyon and the overgrown vacant lot that nobody claims? That area has always been a highway for thieves, drifters, and people with bad intentions. She doesn't know the true value of the dog she just threw away over a few hairs in her pristine living room. Rusty wasn't just some lapdog. 8 years ago, when the break-ins in this neighborhood started getting violent, an old friend of mine, a retired cop whose wife I helped deliver triplets, offered me a hand. He used to train canine units for the state police. He saw massive potential in Rusty. For months, he came over in the afternoons to train him. Rusty was hardwired to guard the exact perimeter of our property. He knew the limits of the backyard wall like the back of his own paw. He was trained not to bark foolishly, like the neighbors' dogs that howl at flies. Rusty waited in the shadows. If someone tried to jump the wall, he wouldn't make a sound until the intruder was already inside. Then he would let out a low, deep growl and bare his teeth, backing the person into a corner without biting unless I gave the command, or unless the stranger tried to run. Over the last 5 years, Rusty stopped 4 different men who tried to slip into the house in the dead of night. Every single time. My daughter and her useless husband slept soundly under their high thread count sheets with the AC blasting. They never heard a thing. I would walk downstairs in my nightgown with my flashlight and my old cane, open the back door, look at the criminal paralyzed with terror in front of my dog's fangs, and simply tell them to crawl back the way they came. Then I would pat Rusty on the head, and we'd go back to sleep. That dog was the true and only guard of this glass fortress Melissa thinks she lives in. I wiped my eyes hard. The crying stopped, instantly replaced by a cold, hard clarity. The pain was still there, throbbing like an open wound, but the midwife's mind took control. I stood up and walked over to my dark wood nightstand. I opened the top drawer and pulled out my old cell phone, the kind that only makes calls and sends text messages. Melissa thought she had left me defenseless. She thought that because I was old, widowed, and stuffed into the back bedroom, I had no power over my circumstances. She forgot that the house is still in my name. She forgot that the deal for them to live here rent-free was that I would have peace and respect in my final years. And above all, she forgot that security is an invisible privilege you only notice once it disappears. I stepped up to my bedroom window that overlooks the backyard. I could see the tall weeds of the vacant lot peeking over the top of the old brick wall. There would be no moon tonight. Tonight, the wall would be unprotected. The neighborhood thieves know how to watch. They have patience. They had surely already noticed the absence of the massive brown shadow that used to patrol the grass. I wasn't going to beg Melissa, and I wasn't going to plead with Preston to help me find my dog. They had broken the sacred pact of family. By throwing Rusty out like trash, they threw me out. They told me without using words that my feelings and my well-being were worth less than the cleanliness of their furniture. I took a deep breath, feeling the warm air fill my tired lungs. My fingers, still nimble despite my age and wear, dialed a number from memory. I didn't call the police or an animal shelter. I called my lawyer, Arthur, a man from my own generation who understands that deals are to be respected until the grave. I listened to the line ring 3 times before his raspy voice answered on the other end. "Sylvia, what a miracle. Is everything all right over there?" he asked kindly. I looked out the window one more time. The afternoon shadows were starting to stretch across the damp grass, the exact spot where Rusty used to lay and soak up the morning sun. "Arthur," I said, my voice steady, not a single syllable shaking. "My daughter gave my dog away. She said he makes a mess and eats too much. She sent him out to the country and refuses to tell me who has him." There was a brief silence on the line. Arthur knew Rusty. He knew the history of the house, and he knew Melissa's intentions of taking over the entire lot to build luxury condos the second I dropped dead. "I am so sorry, Sylvia. That dog was worth his weight in gold," he replied, instantly grasping the gravity of the situation. "What do you want to do? Do you want me to have someone track him down through the adoption groups? We can threaten her with a lawsuit for theft of property, legally. The animal is yours." I pressed the receiver against my ear, my gaze fixed on the back gate, imagining the shadows that would soon start climbing over it when the early morning hours hit. "No, Arthur, that will take time. And time is what we have the least of right now. I want you here tomorrow, first thing in the morning, with the papers for the house. All the papers." "Are you sure, Sylvia?" The lawyer's voice shifted, becoming more professional, more cautious. "Absolutely," I answered, feeling the weight of my 75 years forge into an unstoppable force. She broke the rules. She took away my guard, my family, and as I told her, well, I didn't tell her, but she'll know soon enough, without the dog, the deal for the house is canceled. And without the dog, tonight they are going to learn the true terror of living on the edge of the canyon. "Prepare the eviction." I placed the receiver of the old phone back on its base with a slow, deliberate motion. The clack of plastic against plastic echoed in the silence of my room, like the slam of a judge's gavel handing down a sentence. I had taken the first step. Arthur, a man of his word and old-school law, was already drafting the documents that would put an end to my own daughter's abuse. However, legal papers take time. They demand signatures, stamps, and bureaucracy in government offices that smell like stale coffee and damp paper. And I, even with the patience that comes with old age, could not allow my dog to spend a single night more thinking I had betrayed him. I stood by the dark wood nightstand, still feeling the jagged outline of my iron keys inside my apron pocket. Those keys are heavy. They carry the weight of history, the weight of memory, in a house that has been stripped of its soul to be filled with white furniture and useless glass trinkets. I walked over to the small window of my room and pulled back the thick fabric curtain just a fraction. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip behind the houses on the next block, painting the sky a deep purple that announced the arrival of the night. The tall weeds in the vacant lot bordering our backyard swayed in the warm breeze. From up here, the brick wall my late husband built with his bare hands looked imposing. But I knew the truth. I knew that without the constant, silent, and menacing presence of Rusty, that wall was nothing more than a stepping stone for the thugs who creep up from the canyon when the city goes to sleep. I let the curtain fall and sat in the wicker chair I keep in the corner. It was time to think with a cold head. Like a midwife, I learned early in life that panic is survival's worst enemy. When a woman is in bed sweating, screaming in agony, blood staining the sheets, and the child refusing to come out, you cannot sit there and cry with her. You have to evaluate what you have on hand. Hot water, clean cloths, herbs for the pain, the strength of your own hands, and the iron will to force life to make a way. At my age, society, and my daughter Melissa in particular, has decided that my time for being useful has expired. Old age is a very peculiar cloak of invisibility. When you cross a certain threshold, people stop looking you in the eye. They look at your forehead or your shoulders, or they just look right through you. They assume that because your steps are slow, your thoughts must drag just as heavily. They think the selective deafness we use to ignore their stupidity is a failure of our ears, rather than a protective measure for our own mental peace. Melissa and her husband Preston look at me like an antique ornament, a breathing lump they only tolerate because I handed over the main part of the house so they wouldn't have to pay a mortgage. They think my silence at dinner while they talk about their trips, their green juice diets, and their renovations is submission. They don't realize that the silence of the elderly is actually pure observation. I observe how Preston leaves the sliding glass kitchen door unlocked because he's too lazy to push the latch all the way down. I observe how Melissa never fixed the motion sensor light in the backyard because it ruined the look of her freshly painted wall. And anyway, Mom's loud dog always warns us if something's out there. I observe how they blindly trust 2 tiny security cameras bought off the internet that don't even have real night vision. They have built a fortress out of tissue paper, and they believe they are invincible. I pushed myself up from the armchair and walked over to my wardrobe. Behind my dresses and my mothball-scented folded sweaters, I keep a small cedar box. I lifted the lid, and the scent of aged wood filled my lungs. I didn't dig for jewelry because I never had any. My husband and I poured every last dime into the foundation of this house and into Melissa's education. An education that filled her head with numbers, but emptied her chest of empathy. What I pulled from the box was my most valuable asset, an old composition notebook. Its black vinyl covers cracked from time and heavy use. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. The yellowed, crisp pages were filled with my cursive handwriting. It was my ledger. The name of every mother, the date, the time, the baby's sex, and the address of every single delivery I attended in this neighborhood and the surrounding areas since 1978. Here lay the secrets of hundreds of families. Here were the lives I pulled back from the brink of death when there were no hospitals nearby and no money to pay a city doctor. Melissa thinks Preston's money in the bank is power. Poor fool. True power in this world is not measured in bank accounts. It is measured in loyalty. It is measured by the number of people who remember who reached out a hand when they were drowning. I ran my index finger down the pages, feeling the rough texture of the paper, until I found the year Frank's wife gave birth to the triplets. Frank, the retired cop, the very same man who trained Rusty. I jotted down the phone number for his son's house, where Frank lived now. Then I looked up the record for Shirley's daughter. Shirley, the woman who runs the Sunday farmers market. Her daughter went into labor right in the middle of a massive storm 22 years ago. I walked 10 blocks in knee-deep water to reach her tin roof shack and save them both from a guaranteed hemorrhage. That baby born on that stormy night is now Tyler, a brilliant kid who spends all his time on computers and manages every local online group for the area. With the numbers in hand, I picked up my old cell phone again. The first call was to Frank. When he heard my voice, he was happy, but his tone shifted to a cold, contained fury the second I told him what Melissa had done with Rusty. "That animal isn't just some regular dog," Sylvia Frank said, his raspy voice clearing its throat on the other end. "That dog has tactical training. If they throw him in a pen with farm animals or chain him up, he's either going to shut down or turn aggressive from the stress of not having a clear territory to patrol." "Did she tell you what town they took him to?" "She didn't tell me anything, Frank. Just that it was through an online group, and the family lives 2 hours out in the country. She refuses to give me the details." "Don't worry about it. I know half the highway patrolmen in this region. Plenty of them owe me favors. I'm putting the word out. A dog that size with that specific build doesn't just vanish. And if I have to, I will personally show up at your daughter's door and drag the information out of her, badge or no badge. Leave my daughter to me, Frank." I replied with a calm that surprised even myself. I just need your help tracking him down. Whatever happens inside this house, I will handle. The second call was to Tyler. The kid answered quickly, surrounded by loud music and the clacking of keyboards. The moment I told him who I was, the volume dropped instantly. Miss Sylvia, what a surprise. You know I'd do anything for you. My grandma always tells me, if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be here causing trouble. I laid out the situation. I asked him to scrub every adoption, buy and sell, and livestock group in the city and the surrounding rural towns. I gave him Rusty's description, the dates, and even the specific snooty phrases Melissa would have naturally used in her post. Piece of cake, Miss Sylvia, the kid assured me. Those rich folks always use the same exact Facebook pages to dump whatever doesn't match their living room anymore. Give me a couple of hours. I'll find the post, the profile of the guy who took him, and even his IP address if they want to play hardball. I'll let you know. I closed the black vinyl notebook and set it back inside the cedar box. I felt a wave of absolute peace wash over my chest. My invisible net was cast. My army, the one Melissa looked down on for being working class, street smart, and local, was mobilizing for me and for my dog. Now all that was left was to set up the second phase of my plan. The lesson. I heard the front door open and slam shut. It was Preston. I heard his nasal voice greeting Melissa, followed by the clatter of his keys dropping into the ceramic bowl by the entryway. I heard the routine kiss, the murmur of his complaints about the traffic, and his job at the bank. I stepped out of my room and walked down the hallway toward the kitchen. I needed a glass of water, but mostly I needed to survey the terrain. When I walked in, Preston was loosening his silk tie while Melissa poured him sparkling water into a tall glass. Seeing me, Preston forced a condescending smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good evening, mother-in-law," he practically shouted, raising his voice unnecessarily, as if I were deaf. Melissa already told me about the little dog. It was for the best, believe me. That breed needs a lot of land, a lot of space. The poor animal was just suffering here, and honestly, the house was starting to smell terrible. "You'll see, you'll get used to the cleanliness in no time." I stared at him. His hands, soft and perfectly manicured, held the glass with an almost feminine delicacy. That man wouldn't know how to change a tire, let alone defend his house from an intruder. His entire concept of manhood resided in his gold credit card and the digital locks he had hired someone to install on the front door. "Good evening, Preston," I replied, completely ignoring his speech about the dog. My voice was flat, devoid of any inflection. Melissa glanced at me out of the corner of her eye, surprised that I wasn't making a scene or crying. She sighed in relief, assuming I had surrendered, that I had accepted my place as the harmless old woman who obeys the rules of the younger generation. "Mom, I left some chicken breast in the fridge in case you want dinner," Melissa said, adopting a fake maternal tone. "Preston and I ordered sushi, but I know you don't like raw food." "Thank you. I'm not hungry. I just came for water," I said, opening the cabinet to grab my heavy glass tumbler, the only one that doesn't belong to her imported set. As I filled the glass from the dispenser, my eyes drifted toward the sliding glass door that leads to the backyard. It was large, beautiful, and let in incredible light in the mornings. But the lock, a cheap metal latch at the bottom, was loose. I had warned them about it months ago. I told them the wood of the frame was rotting from the condensation of the AC, and the latch didn't catch right. They called me paranoid. They told me nobody was going to scale a wall that high, and besides, we were in a residential neighborhood. The neighborhood might have a new name now, but the canyon is exactly the same. And the people who walk the bottom of that canyon when there is no moon are the same too. I drank my water in silence. They kept talking about their day, about some new app on their phones, entirely ignoring my presence. I was invisible again. But this time, the invisibility was my shield. I turned around and walked back down the long hallway to my room. I wasn't going to warn them. I wasn't going to ask them to double-check the locks or turn on the patio lights. For 9 years, Rusty was the alarm and the wall. For 9 years. My dog did the dirty work of keeping the darkness at bay so they could sleep, dreaming about their promotions and their vacations. They decided to tear down the wall. Now it was their turn to meet the dark. I walked into my bedroom. I didn't turn on the light. The shadows embraced me, instantly familiar and protective. I pulled my ring of iron keys from my pocket. I selected the longest, thickest key. I slid it into the antique lock of my solid wood door, the only door in the house that survived Melissa's remodel, because I stood in front of it and refused to let the carpenters touch it. I turned the key. The metallic clack of the deadbolt sliding deep into the frame was loud, definitive. My room. Tucked at the back of the house, but secured by the wrought iron window grates my husband welded himself, was a bunker. I walked over to the chair by the window. I sat in the dark, the black vinyl notebook resting on my knees, my eyes locked on the brick wall out in the yard. The central air conditioning hummed in the background, generating a white noise that would lull my daughter and her husband right to sleep. But I wasn't listening to the hum. My ears, trained to catch the faintest first cry of a newborn through adobe walls, were tuned to the sounds of the night. The snapping of dry branches in the vacant lot, the wind rattling the tin roof of some distant shack, the subtle scrape of something climbing the exterior wall. Preston and Melissa actually believed danger could be wiped away by running a bleach mop over the kitchen floor. They had no idea that true cleansing in this world sometimes requires everything to get filthy with fear first. I pulled my shawl tight around my shoulders and settled in to wait, knowing that the early morning hours always bring the truth that the daylight tries to hide. The analog clock on my wall read 2 a.m. The house was submerged in that specific kind of heavy silence you only feel when the entire world seems to have stopped breathing. I was still sitting in my wicker chair, wrapped in my dark wool shawl, my eyes wide open, staring through the crack in the curtains. The darkness in my room was absolute, but my pupils, long accustomed to endless nights on watch, could easily make out every shadow in the backyard. The hum of the central AC suddenly cut out. Melissa's thermostat, always programmed to save energy in the middle of the night, killed the white noise that flooded the house. That was when the night truly came alive. Without the motor of that machine masking reality, the sounds of the canyon began bleeding through the walls. As a midwife, I learned to listen to the human body. I can distinguish the faint heartbeat of a child tangled in its umbilical cord, the sigh of relief from an exhausted mother, and the grinding of pelvic bones making way for life. Listening is an art that requires patience. So when the first unnatural sound broke the stillness of the vacant lot, I didn't panic. I just tightened my grip on the iron keys resting in my lap. It was a dry scrape, the sound of a rubber sole dragging against the porous bricks of the back wall. I adjusted my posture in the chair, feeling my own heartbeat pulsing in my temples. For 9 years, this was the exact moment when a low, deep, guttural growl would have rattled the window panes. Rusty would have risen from his corner, muscles coiled, hackles raised, planting himself dead in the center of the lawn like a bronze statue. The intruders would have heard that warning sound and dropped right back down into the brush, knowing that on the other side of that wall waited a beast trained to tear their legs apart. But tonight, there was no growl, no warning, just the dull thud of a heavy body landing on the wet grass of our yard. I held my breath. Through the gap in the curtain, I watched a dark silhouette slowly straighten up. Then a second shadow dropped down beside him. 2 men. They stayed perfectly still for a full minute, crouched low among the rose bushes Melissa had planted last spring. They were waiting. They knew the reputation of this house. The entire lower neighborhood knew that old Sylvia had a dog that didn't bark, but hunted. One of the men pulled something from his jacket and tossed it toward the center of the yard. I saw the lump hit the grass. It was almost certainly a piece of meat laced with poison or sleeping pills. An old, cowardly tactic. They waited another minute. Nothing moved. The house remained dead silent. "Told you, man," one of them whispered, his raspy voice drifting right up to my window. The landscaper down the block said the snobs here got rid of the dog this afternoon. The beast is gone. The other man let out a short, almost inaudible laugh, but it was loaded with a confidence that turned my stomach. They stood up with total ease. They were no longer crouching. They walked like they owned the place, trampling the flowers and leaving deep mud tracks across the light-colored stones bordering the empty pool. My left hand felt around the nightstand for my old cell phone. I turned the screen on beneath my shawl so the backlight wouldn't give me away. I dialed Frank's number. I knew he was awake, scouring the internet groups and working his contacts to find my dog. He answered on the second ring. "Sylvia, I still don't have news on. They are inside Frank." I interrupted, my voice reduced to an icy whisper. Two men just jumped the back wall. They're heading for the sliding glass door. There was a fraction of a second of dead air on the line. The old cop's brain ran the calculations instantly. "Do not leave your room under any circumstances," Frank ordered, his tone sharp, leaving no room for argument. "I am 5 blocks from your house. I was just interrogating a kid by the market. I have my piece on me. I'm radioing the sector patrol right this second, but I'll get there first. Lock your door and stay dead quiet." "The deadbolt is already thrown," I replied and hung up. I peeked through the curtain again. The men were already on the patio. One of them clicked on a small pen light, the kind that barely puts out a sliver of bluish light, and shined it into the kitchen. The beam danced across the stainless steel appliances and the granite countertops that gave Melissa so much pride. The taller man pulled a metal pry bar from his pants and wedged it into the track of the sliding glass door. Preston, in his infinite laziness and arrogance, had never fixed that latch. The lock gave way with a pathetic metallic snap. I almost felt sorry for him. The great fortress of the modern couple, their precious glass castle, had been breached in under 3 minutes. They slid the door open. The smell of canyon dampness and stale sweat flooded into the house, violently clashing with the ridiculous scent of artificial lavender. I heard their boots step onto the freshly mopped porcelain tile. One step, then another. I stayed seated in the dark, gripping my keys. I wasn't going to go out there. It would be outright stupidity for me to try and face 2 young, armed criminals. My role tonight wasn't to be the savior. My role was to be the witness. Melissa had made a unilateral decision about the security of this family, ignoring my voice, my experience, and my property. Now life was going to teach her a lesson that no expensive university ever could. The silence inside the house shattered with the sound of kitchen drawers being yanked open and dumped onto the floor. They were looking for the silverware, the car keys, the wallets Preston casually tossed on the breakfast bar. I heard hurried whispering. They were nervous, but greedy, intoxicated by how easy the score was. Then the footsteps moved toward the main living room. That was where the massive flat screen, the gaming consoles, and the imported decor sat. Suddenly a sharp, crystalline crash ripped through the early morning air. One of the thieves tripped over the coffee table. I heard the crunch of tempered glass exploding against the floor, followed by a curse muttered through gritted teeth. Upstairs in the master bedroom, the noise was enough. I heard the squeak of the expensive mattress springs as someone shot up. Bare feet hit the hardwood floor above. It was Preston. "Melissa, did you leave something on downstairs?" I heard him ask, his voice thick with sleep echoing down the stairwell. The thieves froze. Silence fell over the house again, but this time it was an electric silence, loaded with a tension that choked the air. Preston flicked on the upstairs hallway light. The yellow glow spilled down the stairs, illuminating the wrecked living room. "Who's down there?" Preston yelled. His voice tried to sound authoritative, but it cracked on the last syllable. It wasn't the voice of a man ready to defend his home. It was the voice of a terrified little boy. I heard his footsteps slowly descending the stairs. Every step was a fatal mistake. If Rusty had been here, Preston would never have had to come down. The dog would have pinned the intruders to the wall, paralyzed by the terror of his fangs until the cops arrived. But Preston was walking down alone, unarmed, wearing his silk pajamas straight into the wolf's mouth. "Freeze right there, you piece of shit," a voice barked from the living room. I heard a sickening thud, the sound of a heavy body being thrown violently against the white sofas. Preston let out a high-pitched scream, a hoarse, panic-filled wail that chilled my blood despite my resolve. "Please don't hurt me. Take whatever you want," my son-in-law begged instantly. All his arrogance, all that condescending attitude he threw at me every afternoon, evaporated in a split second. He was crying. He was crying with the exact same high-pitched pitch of a newborn, feeling the cold air for the very first time. Upstairs, Melissa woke up screaming. "Preston! What's happening, Preston?" my daughter shrieked, leaning over the banister. "Shut your mouth and get down here, bitch, or I blow your husband's head off," the second thief roared. Pure terror flooded the house. Melissa started shrieking hysterically. I heard her stumbling down the stairs, her muffled sobs, the sound of her knees slamming into the floor as they forced her to lay down next to her husband. I was still in my room, 40 feet away down the hallway. I could hear every frantic breath, every insult, the sound of things being ripped off the walls. My motherly instinct, the one that forced me to work from sunup to sundown to pay for Melissa's schooling, screamed at me to open the door, to march out there with my cane and defend my blood. But my midwife's mind, cold and calculating, kept me anchored to the chair. If I went out there, they would kill me. Or worse, use me to force them to open the safe. I couldn't do anything physically. My work was already done. Help was on the way. In the distance, bouncing off the canyon walls, the high wail of a siren began to bleed into the night. The thieves heard it too. "The pigs are coming, man, let's go," one of them yelled, panic staining his voice. I heard the heavy thud of backpacks stuffed with electronics banging against the walls as they sprinted toward the kitchen. "The car keys, give me the keys," the other demanded, delivering a brutal kick to something or someone on the floor. Preston groaned in agony. "I don't have them, they're by the door. Please stop hitting me," my son-in-law sobbed. The siren was screaming closer. Red and blue lights began flashing violently against the front windows of the house. Then I heard the brutal screech of tires locking up on the pavement right outside. It was Frank. He had beaten the patrol car cutting through back streets he knew by heart. Out the back run. The two men abandoned the idea of the car. I heard their boots slipping on the slick kitchen tile to crash as they slammed into the aluminum frame of the sliding door, and their frantic footsteps tearing up the lawn. They vaulted the wall with the same agility they used to get in, disappearing into the blackness of the canyon, swallowed by the very weeds they crawled out of. Seconds later, Frank's heavy fist pounded on the front door, with a force that rattled the windows. "Police, open the door," my old friend roared, his voice like thunder cutting through the chaos. Inside, the house fell into a dead silence, broken only by Preston's pathetic whimpering and Melissa's uncontrollable sobbing. They dragged themselves across the floor, paralyzed with fear, until they reached the entryway. I heard the digital locks being fumbled with trembling hands. The door burst open. Frank's voice flooded the room, demanding to know if they were okay and barking for a description of the suspects. Right then, the sector patrol car arrived, sirens blaring, slamming on the brakes in front of our gate. The crackle of police radios, the heavy boots of officers storming the house, and the ensuing chaos fully took over my home. I stood up slowly. My knees popped from sitting still for so long. I adjusted my shawl over my shoulders, smoothed out the skirt of my dress, and slipped my cell phone into my apron pocket. I took my iron keys, walked to my bedroom door, slid the key into the deadbolt, and turned it. The heavy clack of the metal unlocking echoed into the dark hallway. I pulled the solid wood door open and stepped out. I walked down the hall at a slow, measured pace toward the living room. Every light in the house was blazing. The scene before my eyes looked exactly like a delivery room after a severe hemorrhage. Everything was displaced, filthy, branded by trauma. The glass coffee table was obliterated. The drawers of the white cabinets had been ripped out and dumped across the imported rugs. The massive flat screen was gone from the wall, leaving black cables dangling like severed veins. In the dead center of the wreckage were my daughter and my son-in-law. Preston was sitting on the floor, hugging his knees, a trail of blood leaking from his split lip, his silk pajamas smeared with mud. Melissa was shaking violently beside him, her hair a tangled mess, her face as pale as paper, answering a young officer's questions with a voice that was barely a whisper. Frank was standing by the kitchen door, inspecting the busted latch on the slider, When he saw me walk into the room, his eyes met mine. He gave me a nearly imperceptible nod, confirming that he knew exactly why I had timed this lesson the way I did. Melissa looked up and saw me standing at the end of the hall. Her eyes, which just yesterday were full of condescending impatience, were now blown wide open, overflowing with a primal, childish terror. "Mom!" she screamed, her voice breaking as she tried to scramble up from the floor. "Mom, they broke in! They were going to kill us! They tied us up! They took everything! They almost killed Preston!" I didn't run to hug her. I didn't throw myself on the floor to weep with them. I stood perfectly straight, resting both hands on the handle of my cane, observing the scene with the exact same absolute coldness I used to evaluate first-time mothers who actually believed labor wouldn't hurt. My gaze dropped to the living room floor. The shiny white tiles, the ones Melissa forced the maid to mop 3 times a day because she couldn't stand the smell of an old dog, were covered in black mud, scuff marks from dirty boots, dead leaves from the canyon, and drops of her husband's blood. The pristine illusion of her lie had been trampled by the brutal reality of the real world. I looked back up and locked eyes with my crying daughter. "The outside world is very dirty, Melissa," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the murmur of the cops and Preston's sniffling. "And without a guardian to protect you from the filth ends up right inside your bedroom." The red and blue lights of the patrol cars finally stopped flashing against the shattered glass of the facade. It was 6 a.m. The air in the house had completely changed. The ridiculous scent of artificial lavender had been entirely replaced by the metallic stench of fear, my son-in-law's cold sweat, and the dark gray dust the crime scene techs had smeared all over the doors and drawers, looking for fingerprints that wouldn't do a damn thing. The officers left with their notepads full of useless scribbles and empty promises to run extra patrols. I knew with the absolute certainty that comes from surviving 75 years in this world that those thieves were already fencing the TV and the consoles at some black market swap meet across town. The silence that followed the police's departure was crushing. I walked slowly into the kitchen, leaning my weight on my old mesquite wood cane. My thick-soled shoes crunched over the remains of a porcelain vase Melissa had bought on one of her trips. I navigated around the dumped drawers and stepped up to the stove. I turned on the burner and set water to boil in my chipped enamel pot, the only piece of cookware of mine that survived my daughter's minimalist purge. Melissa and Preston were sitting on the high stools at the granite island. They looked like ghosts. Preston was holding a bag of ice against his busted lip, his 1,000-yard stare locked on the mud-stained floor. Melissa had her arms crossed tightly over her chest, shivering even though the sun was already up, and the morning heat was starting to bleed through the curtainless windows. "We have to hire private security, Preston," Melissa mumbled, her voice gravelly from crying so much. "We need to put up electrified fences, motion sensor cameras, alarms wired straight to the precinct. We can't sleep here another night like this." I scooped 2 spoonfuls of pot coffee into the boiling water. The dark, roasted aroma filled my space, giving me the jolt my old bones were begging for after a night on watch. "We had all of that," I said, without looking at them twisting the knob to kill the flame. "And it didn't cost us a single red cent in electricity." Melissa snapped her head up, her swollen, bloodshot eyes drilled into my back. "What are you talking about, Mom? Please don't start with your nonsense right now. We were almost murdered." Her pitch rose heavy with that specific hysteria spoiled people use when reality refuses to bend to their tantrums. I turned around slowly, cupping my hot mug in both hands. I leaned back against the kitchen counter and looked at her with the icy detachment of a surgeon about to make the first incision. "I'm talking about Rusty Melissa. I am talking about the dog you dumped yesterday afternoon because his hair was annoying you on your white rug. The same rug that is currently soaked in your husband's blood." Preston whimpered softly and shifted the ice pack on his mouth, but he didn't dare make eye contact. "He was an old dog, Mom, a street mutt. What was he going to do against 2 armed men?" She shot back, desperately trying to defend her idiotic choice. I let out a dry laugh, a harsh, scraping sound that echoed off the kitchen tiles. "That street mutt, as you call him, stopped 4 men over the last 5 years. 4. While the 2 of you were dead to the world with your AC blasting, Rusty was patrolling the canyon wall. He was trained by the state police, Melissa. He knew how to corner a man in the pitch black without making a single sound. Right up until the thief realized he had the jaws of a Belgian Malinois 2 inches from his throat. The color drained completely from my daughter's face. Her lips trembled, but no words came out. Preston lowered the ice bag, exposing his swollen purple lip. "We had an attack dog loose in the backyard," Preston asked, his voice barely a squeak of pure horror. "Every single night." "You had a guardian," I corrected him, my tone turning to steel. A guardian who knew his family and respected his territory. A guardian who never asked for a damn thing other than a bowl of kibble and a corner to sleep in. But you two decided your aesthetic was more important than our safety. You cut the lock off the front gate and let the wolves right into the house. So don't come crying to me about your broken trinkets. The chime of the front doorbell shattered the tension in the kitchen. It was exactly 8 a.m. Melissa jumped in her seat, terrified by the noise, as if the thieves had decided to come back in broad daylight. "Did you call insurance, Preston?" she asked, running her hands nervously through her tangled hair. "I wasn't me," he replied, shrinking down. I set my enamel mug on the counter and grabbed my cane. "It was me," I announced, walking with a heavy, deliberate stride toward the hall. "And it's not insurance." I reached the entryway, where the digital lock was now just a smashed piece of plastic from the cops kicking the door open. I pulled the heavy wood open. Standing outside, framed in the doorway, was Arthur. He was wearing his usual gray suit, perfectly pressed, holding a worn black leather briefcase in his right hand. Despite his 78 years, his posture was ramrod straight, and his gaze was sharp as a razor. "Good morning, Sylvia," Arthur greeted, tipping his dark felt hat with old-school manners. "I am incredibly sorry to be arriving under these conditions. Frank called me before dawn to fill me in on the incident. Are you unharmed?" "Good morning, Arthur. Please come in. I am perfectly fine. The damage here was purely material and pride," I answered, stepping aside to let him pass. Arthur walked into the living room, evaluating the wreckage with a professional eye. He didn't gasp, he didn't judge. He simply kept walking until he reached the dining room, where the massive oak table, one of the few original pieces I had flat out refused to let them throw away, remained untouched. Melissa and Preston crept out of the kitchen, looking thoroughly confused by the presence of this older gentleman they barely remembered seeing at my husband's funeral over a decade ago. "Mom, who is this man? Is he a private adjuster?" Melissa asked, approaching with deep suspicion. "I am Arthur Vance, your mother's attorney and a notary." He introduced himself, setting his briefcase down on the oak table and popping the metal latches with 2 loud, sharp clicks. "And I am not here to appraise your damaged furniture, ma'am. I am here to execute a legal directive regarding the status of this property." Preston furrowed his brow, letting out a hiss of pain from his lip. "Property? What are you talking about? This is our house. We paid for the entire remodel 3 years ago. We sank over $100,000 into changing the floors, knocking down walls and updating the grid." Arthur pulled a thick manila folder from his briefcase, opening it on the table with deliberate slowness, pulling out a stack of stamped papers, signed in old blue ink. "You invested in the decor, son," Arthur corrected him, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "But the lot, the foundation, the load-bearing walls, and the title to this estate belongs solely and exclusively to Mrs. Sylvia. I have the original deed right here, the transfer documents from her late husband, and the county property records updated as of yesterday afternoon. Your name, Preston, and yours, Melissa, do not appear on a single legal document granting you rights to this land." Silence crashed down on the room again, but this wasn't the silence of being afraid of robbers. It was the absolute, suffocating silence of losing all power. Melissa stared at me, her eyes blown wide, searching for an explanation I was not going to give her. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The verbal agreement we made 5 years ago was crystal clear. I took the floor, stepping forward and planting both hands firmly on the handle of my cane. You two wanted to stop paying rent on your tiny apartment downtown. You offered to remodel the house so we could all live comfortably. I agreed to give you the upstairs and the common areas in exchange for respect, peace, and the promise that you wouldn't mess with my routines or my companions. "It's a dog, Mom." Melissa exploded, unable to hold it in, slapping her palm against the oak table. "You're pulling this whole circus over a disgusting animal. We were almost killed today, and you come out here waving lawyer papers." Do not raise your voice at your mother in her own house. Arthur roared with a force I didn't know he had left in him, slamming his fist onto the table. The sound cracked like a gunshot, making Melissa physically recoil in fear. I stepped right up to the table, feeling my blood boiling, but keeping my mind as cold as ice. No, Melissa, it's not over a dog. It's over what your action means. You threw my family in the trash without consulting me. You treated me like a burden, like an unwanted guest in the house your father and I built brick by brick with the sweat off our backs. You really thought that by putting a flat screen in my bedroom and paying for my blood pressure pills, you had bought my submission. Preston tried to jump in, holding his hands up in a placating gesture that only made him look more pathetic. Mother-in-law, please. We are all highly stressed right now. The situation got out of hand, but we can fix this. We're family. This is our house. This was my house, Preston. Now it's just a broken glass box. I cut him off, staring a hole right through him, and you two proved you don't know how to live in it, and you sure as hell don't know how to protect it. You broke the pact, and in my world, the world of the old folks, you look down on for being slow and outdated. A person's word weighs heavier than any contract. Arthur picked up one of the sheets from the folder and slid it across the table to where they were standing. It was drafted on official letterhead, covered in notary stamps and fresh signatures. This is an official notice of eviction, due to termination of verbal tenancy, the lawyer explained, his voice slipping right back into a flat, professional drone, like he was reading the weather report. Legally, you are occupying this property as at-will tenants. The rightful owner has decided to revoke that permission. You have exactly 30 calendar days to pack your belongings, rip out your fancy appliances if you so choose, and vacate the premises. Preston's knees seemed to give out. He dropped heavily into one of the dining chairs, burying his face in his hands. Melissa started shaking her head frantically, fresh tears of pure rage spilling down her cheeks. "You can't do this to me. I'm your only daughter," she screamed, her voice shredded completely, forgetting her pose as a sophisticated society woman. "We have nowhere to go. We dumped our entire life savings into this house. You have 30 days to find a place. With your executive salaries, I am sure you'll have no problem renting one of those modern apartments you love so much. The ones where neighbors don't speak to each other, and the security guards fall asleep at the front desk." I answered, utterly relentless. I felt no pity. I only felt the raw, pure justice you only learn on the dusty streets of this neighborhood. Right at that exact moment, the piercing ringtone of my old cell phone shattered the tension in the dining room. It was a crude, polyphonic chirp that clashed terribly with the ruins of the high-end tech the thieves hadn't managed to steal. I reached into my apron pocket and pulled the brick out. The tiny screen lit up with Tyler's name, the computer whiz from the market. I answered immediately and pressed it to my ear. "Talk to me, Tyler," I said, completely ignoring my daughter's sobbing. "We found him, Miss Sylvia." The kid's voice was euphoric, shouting over the roar of wind and an engine in the background. That stuck-up lady posted him in a closed livestock trading group. She gave him to some guy who runs a plot of land out by the Santa Clara limits. Her post literally said the dog was highly aggressive and wouldn't let anyone touch him. Well, yeah, he's a police dog, not a teddy bear. A knot in my chest that I didn't even know I was holding began to slowly unravel. My shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. "Where is he right now?" I asked, feeling a familiar warmth rush into my cheeks. "Frank already went and got him. He pulled up to the farm half an hour ago with a highway patrol buddy of his. The farmer guy had him chained to a lemon tree because Rusty wouldn't let him get close enough to even give him water. Frank just flashed his badge, told the guy a few choice words, and the dude was practically begging for forgiveness. They're on their way back now. Give them maybe 40 minutes, and they'll be knocking on your door." I closed my eyes for a second, silently thanking life, the memory of my husband, and the unbreakable loyalty of working-class people who never, ever forget a favor. "Thank you, son. You have no idea the weight you just lifted off me. Tell your mother I'm stopping by next week to settle my tab with interest," I said, a genuine smile forming entirely on its own across my wrinkled lips. "Don't even think about it, Miss Sylvia. We owe you our lives here. Big hug." I hung up the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. When I opened my eyes, Melissa and Preston were staring at me like I was a total stranger. They had just witnessed how, while they fell apart in their own living room, without even knowing how to call their insurance company, I had mobilized an invisible army, reclaimed my property, and tracked down my stolen companion. The power dynamic in the room was so glaringly obvious, you could practically reach out and touch it. While you two were crying over your flat screen, my people found my family. I informed them, my head held high. Rusty is on his way. He'll be here in under an hour. Preston leaped out of his chair, backing away toward the hallway, as if the dog were already walking through the front door. The terror in his eyes was absolute. The trauma of the home invasion was slamming head-on into the realization that the animal they despised so much was in fact the rightful lord of the shadows in this house. "We can't stay here," Preston stammered awkwardly, grabbing Melissa by the arm. "Melissa, we cannot stay. That dog is going to attack us. The thieves, the broken doors, the lack of security. No, no, no. We are going to a hotel right now." Melissa, utterly defeated, drained of all her classism and arrogance, slowly nodded. Her tears had ruined her expensive makeup, leaving black streaks under her eyes. She looked small, fragile, exactly the way she looked when she was a little girl who fell playing in the dirt on an unpaved street. She didn't say a word to me. There were no apologies, no screaming, no threats of taking me to court. She knew she had lost. She knew Arthur Vance wasn't a man to play games with, and she knew my patience had completely run dry. They walked toward the stairs, holding on to each other, climbing the steps with heavy feet to pack a couple of suitcases. Arthur pushed his glasses up and began sliding his documents back into the manila folder. "I will have the copies signed and stamped at the firm by noon, Sylvia. I'll send the official notice over with a courier this afternoon, just to satisfy protocol. Though judging by the look on those two, I highly doubt they're going to fight the 30 days. "They won't, Arthur. They are cowards. They confuse comfort with strength," I replied, walking him toward the front door. "I am deeply grateful you came out here so quickly." "That's what old friends are for," the lawyer smiled, giving my shoulder a gentle pat. "Lock up whatever is left of this door and give Officer Rusty my best when he gets in." Arthur stepped out into the street, which was now bathed in full morning sunlight. I stood in the doorway, feeling the warm breeze on my face. I heard the frantic footsteps of my daughter and son-in-law coming downstairs with their rolling suitcases, tripping over the rubble of their perfect life. They walked out the door without saying goodbye, climbed into their luxury SUV parked on the street, and sped off, fleeing from the ghosts of their own ignorance. I closed the door behind them, shoving the splintered pieces of wood together so they'd fit as best as possible. The house was wrecked, filthy, and dead silent. But for the first time in 5 years, I took a deep breath and felt like the air truly belonged to me. The loud rumble of Frank's truck cut through the quiet street at exactly 9 a.m. I was sitting in the wooden dining chair, my hands resting on the oak table, waiting. When I heard the screech of tires breaking outside my gate, I felt the air rush back into my lungs with the strength of my best years. I stood up slowly, leaned my weight on the mesquite cane, and walked toward the entryway. The heavy wooden door was still splintered from the breach earlier that morning, but that didn't matter anymore. When I pulled it open, the sun hit me square in the face. There was Frank, stepping out of his truck, with the heavy, unmistakable gait of a retired cop. He walked to the back of the rig and dropped the tailgate on the metal camper shell. There was no need to call his name. Rusty vaulted from the bed of the truck onto the concrete sidewalk with an agility that completely defied his 9 years. His massive paws hit the pavement, and his head snapped up instantly. His ears perked up as he recognized the street, the scent of the nearby canyon, and above all, the sight of me standing in the doorway of the house. He didn't run like some crazy puppy. Rusty was a working dog, an old soldier. He walked toward me at a brisk, purposeful pace, his brown tail thumping back and forth in hard, rhythmic sweeps. When he reached my feet, he lowered his head and shoved his wet snout firmly into the palm of my hand. The feel of his rough, toasted brown coat was the absolute best medicine for the exhaustion of the night. He smelled like strange dirt, dry weeds, and the sheer stress of being chained up in an unknown place. But underneath all of that, he still smelled like my home. I dropped to my knees with a bit of effort, ignoring the sharp pain in my joints, and wrapped my arms around his thick neck. I buried my face in his back and took a deep breath. "You're right here, boy," I whispered in his ear, feeling his heartbeat synchronize with mine. "You're back in your territory." Frank walked up, pulling off his cap to wipe the sweat from his forehead. Took a little convincing to get the farmer to drop the chain, Sylvia. The animal wouldn't let him within 6 feet. He was furious, stressed out of his mind from not having a clear perimeter to guard. But the second he saw me step out of my buddy's cruiser and I called his name, he locked it down. He knew we were coming for him. "I owe you a massive one, Frank. You and everyone who moved heaven and earth last night." I told him, using my cane to pull myself back up to my feet, while Rusty glued himself to my left leg, assuming his natural guard stance. "You don't owe me a damn thing, woman. You brought my grandkids into this world when the hospital locked its doors. These are your people, and your people don't leave their own behind." The old cop tipped his head in farewell and climbed back into his truck. I stayed in the doorway until the rig turned the corner and disappeared from sight. Then I looked down at my dog and gave a slight nod toward the inside of the house. Rusty stepped in. Instantly, his entire posture shifted. The muscles in his shoulders coiled tight, and the hair on his back raised just a fraction. His incredible nose went to work. He sniffed the black mud tracked across the white porcelain tile. He sniffed the stale stench of fear my son-in-law had left hanging in the air, and he stopped dead in front of the dried blood staining the imported rug in the living room. He let out a low growl, a guttural vibration that rattled in his ribs. He knew his house had been violated. He knew other men had walked through his domain while he wasn't there to stop them. "It's over, Rusty. They're gone," I said, my voice firm, the exact same voice I used to calm down panicking mothers in the middle of labor. The dog looked up at me with his amber eyes, understood the command, and cut the growl. He walked straight down the hallway, resuming his standard patrol route toward the backyard. I followed him at a slow pace. When he reached the sliding glass door, the one with the broken latch, Rusty stepped out onto the damp grass. He went straight to the brick wall bordering the canyon. He sniffed the crushed rose bushes and the boot prints in the dirt. He lifted his leg and marked his territory at every corner, reclaiming what was his. His message was loud and clear. The guard had returned. That very afternoon, the moving truck my daughter hired parked in front of the house. Melissa and Preston didn't even have the spine to show up in person. They sent 4 movers with cardboard boxes and bubble wrap to haul away all their belongings. For hours, the men walked in and out, unmounting the massive TV, carrying the mud-stained white sofas, hauling out the broken glass tables, and packing up every last minimalist trinket I despised so much. I sat in my wicker chair in the corner of the living room, with Rusty laying at my feet watching the parade. The movers kept eyeing the dog nervously, intimidated by his size and his dead silence. But Rusty didn't do a thing. He knew the difference between intruders and men just doing a job. When the truck finally pulled away and the house was empty, the silence that settled in was completely different. It wasn't the oppressive silence of the central AC masking the sounds of the street. It was a clean, vast silence, full of echoes and possibilities. I walked through the deserted living room. The porcelain floor was filthy and covered in dust, but the house felt big again, solid. I walked over to the windows and threw the curtains wide open. I slid the glass panes back and let the hot afternoon air rush in. The wind from the neighborhood swept away the very last traces of the artificial lavender scent. I grabbed an old straw broom, a metal dustpan, and a bucket of water with a bar of lye soap. At 75, sweeping an entire house is no easy task. But strength doesn't always come from muscles. A lot of times it comes from pure willpower. I swept out the mud, swept up the shattered glass, and scrubbed my son-in-law's dried blood off the floor. While I cleaned, I thought about my trade as a midwife. Bringing a life into this world is a violent, chaotic, and dirty process. There is blood, there is sweat. There are screams that shatter your eardrums and fluids that stain the white sheets. City women, the ones who pay for high-end clinics, think birth is supposed to be a sterile event, surrounded by machines and cold lights. But I know the truth. Life is born from mud, from pain, and from tearing. This house had just given birth to a new reality. The break-in at dawn was the agonizing labor. The terror, the violence, and the cowardly retreat of my daughter and her husband were the blood and the afterbirth. And now, as I ran the wet mop across the floor, I was cleaning the newborn. I was reclaiming my space. The following days brought a transformation that the walls of this house had been begging for. The very first morning, Tyler the computer kid showed up at my door with a heavy toolbox and 2 forged steel padlocks. Without charging me a single dime, he yanked out the useless digital lock on the front door and installed a traditional deadbolt, the kind that requires a real key, one that carries weight in your pocket. Then he went out to the backyard and welded a thick iron slide bolt to the glass sliding door, so the next guy who tries to stick a pry bar in the track breaks his teeth trying. Miss Sylvia the kid told me wiping grease off his hands with a rag. Tell Rusty to stop giving me the evil eye. I come in peace. That same afternoon, Shirley, the woman who runs the market stalls, brought over a clay pot full of sweet corn tamales and a pitcher of hot atole. We sat in the chairs around my oak table, the only thing left in the dining room, and talked for hours. We talked about the old days, about the babies I helped deliver who were now married men and women, about the heavy rains that used to flood the neighborhood before they paved the main roads. The isolation my daughter had forced upon me vanished like smoke. Melissa truly believed that by hiding me in the back bedroom and surrounding me with her borrowed luxury, she was taking care of me. She never understood that isolating an old person is the cruelest way to kill them while they're still breathing. By stripping away her expensive decor and her absurd cleanliness rules, the house opened its doors back up to my people. 3 weeks passed. Arthur Vance called me on a Tuesday afternoon to confirm that the voluntary eviction paperwork had been officially filed at the firm. Melissa and Preston signed the lease termination without a fight. They moved to an apartment complex on the exact opposite side of the city, a place surrounded by iron gates, private security guards, and surveillance cameras on every corner. They preferred to pay a fortune in HOA fees to live locked inside another glass bubble, utterly convinced that money can buy the peace that their own cowardice stripped away from them. Melissa only tried to contact me once. She sent a text message to my old cell phone. It read, "I hope you're happy with your dog. Preston is still having nightmares." When you realize you can't maintain that massive house by yourself, don't call us. I read the glowing letters on the tiny screen, hit the delete button, and powered the phone off. I felt no resentment, no sadness, no guilt. I felt absolute clarity. People who do not know how to honor the ground they walk on are condemned to spend their lives running from their own shadows. One Sunday afternoon, I pulled my antique furniture out of the storage room, my old cedar wardrobe, a hand-woven wicker rocking chair, and a pair of dark wood bookcases. I arranged them in the living room, giving the house its character back, its smell of living wood and solid memories. I sat in the rocking chair by the window. The sun was setting, painting the bare walls in a warm orange glow. I reached into the pocket of my cotton apron and pulled out my ring of heavy iron keys. The cold metal quickly warmed against my palm. Those keys now opened every reinforced door, every new padlock, and every opportunity to keep dictating the rules of my own existence. Next to me, resting on a small wooden side table, was my black vinyl notebook. I opened it at random. The yellowed pages crinkled softly. My index finger traced the names written in cursive. Hundreds of lives, hundreds of stories that began right in my own hands, stained with iodine and blood. Society is profoundly wrong about old age. They look at us with pity, assuming our slow steps are a symptom of weakness and our silence is a sign of ignorance. They actually believe that modern tech, smartphone apps, and motion sensors trump the sheer wisdom of the years. But the world is still the exact same savage place it has always been. Evil, greed, and danger do not stop for a touchscreen or a white rug. My power. The power I rediscovered the night they tried to steal my dog does not lie in physical strength. It lies in memory. It lies in knowing exactly who to call, in understanding how true loyalty works, and in never being afraid of the dirt of the world. The deep roots of my past are a wall higher than any intruder could ever hope to climb. Night finally fell over the neighborhood. I switched off the single lamp burning in the living room and walked down the hallway in the dark. I didn't need a light to guide me. I knew every uneven slope of the floorboard, every breath of this brick and mortar structure. I reached my bedroom, the one at the back, the one that was always mine. The window was open, letting in the cool breeze rolling up from the bottom of the canyon. Rusty was laying on his worn little rug at the foot of my bed. Hearing my footsteps, he lifted his head and thumped his tail against the floor a couple of times. I walked over to him, leaned down and stroked his broad forehead. His amber eyes caught the faint moonlight, filled with that silent, unbreakable loyalty that no human being, especially not those raised in spoiled abundance, could ever begin to understand. "Time to clock in, guard," I told him softly. Rusty stood up immediately. He walked to the bedroom door, stepped out into the hall, and headed straight for the sliding glass door in the kitchen. He didn't need me to let him out. He had his own access through the heavy-duty dog door installed in the aluminum frame. I watched him cross the backyard and vanish into the pitch black of the night. I leaned out my window. Out there, between the tall weeds of the vacant lot and the brick wall separating us from the canyon, a massive brown shadow began its patrol. His paws made zero sound. His breathing blended perfectly with the wind. Any thug looking up at this house from the bottom of the abyss would know instantly that the fortress was no longer made of glass. It was made of stone and fangs again. I sat on the edge of my mattress, pulled my shawl tight around my shoulders, and closed my eyes. I know the world out there might be rotting with dark intentions, but in here, inside the house that I built, the darkness plays by my rules.